Today we are in the digital enterprise, but back in the late 1800s, we hadn't even entered into the aeronautical enterprise. I'm standing in front of one of 6 different locations of the Wright Cycle Company that appeared in Dayton, Ohio almost 130 years ago. Orville and Wilbur Wright began their bicycle repair, rental, and sales business in 1892 while continuing to operate a print shop on the second floor. The Wrights used the profits from these businesses and other businesses they had to finance their aviation experiments. The shops closed in 1909 when they started their aviation company, leading us to the next generation. Our second keynote of the day is up next.
Good morning, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Dr. Nate Hartman. Dr. Hartman brings a unique perspective on Industry 4.0. As a professor at Purdue University and the director of the Digital Enterprise Center, he provides the state of the practice for both academia and industry. Dr. Hartman's perspective is grounded in the world-class academic and research program at Purdue University that has been proven while overcoming engineering and Industry 4.0 challenges at Rolls-Royce, Cummins, Boeing, General Motors, Collins Aerospace, Textron, Gulfstream, Procter & Gamble, Honda, and others. Nate, over to you.
Great, thanks, Chris. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you today. Looks like we need to back up just slightly. Sorry. So one of the key points of today's discussion is going to be what is the fourth industrial revolution. And for those of us of a certain age demographic, we came to know the Industrial Revolution 1.0 as the Industrial Revolution and not necessarily a Industrial Revolution. But as we've gone on for the last 100 years or so, we've encountered 3 more, and we're currently in what most people recognize as Industry 4.0. And the importance here is really twofold. One has been the changing nature of the way that we work, and also the duration in between each of these transitions, going from Industry 1.0 to 2.0, and then from 2 to 3 and 3 to 4, has had increasingly shorter and shorter time periods. And so as we've gone from water and steam power and a mostly mechanical way of reducing labor and implementing machines through electrification to automation and ultimately to digitalization and virtualization, that's essentially the transition that we've made to the fourth industrial revolution. However, one thing to keep in mind is that most of this is predicated on the idea of digital disruption. And this slide here shows the transition of some very common platforms that many of us have been used to in our lifetime: music, photography. And we've seen a lot of those transitions go from a very analog format and a very analog way of sharing information to very much a digital and even distributed way of sharing information. And the importance here is not just that the information has changed form, but it's also changed in its platform. And by that I mean, initially we had things like records and rolls of photographic film that we could hold and possess and touch. And it was sold to us and it was used by us in very discrete units and increments. And one of the things that digitalization and digital transformation has brought about has been this change in platform. The idea of moving from local and physical based resources to digital and cloud-based resources. And Major General Cooley spoke about some of that in his presentation this morning, and how the Air Force would like to leverage these kinds of technologies to support the life cycle of platforms. And so these two themes of this ongoing transition and the compression of time between them, as well as this change in form and change in platform, are going to be key elements, of my presentation this morning. And that covers more or less the what is it perspective of my presentation. And the next bits are going to be where it is going and why it is important. And you'll hear some common themes, I think, from what General Cooley presented ahead of me, but also some things that will lead you into the rest of the day and also into the rest of the program. And so with that, let's talk a little bit about where is this going? And so where is Industry 4.0 going, and how might we actually get there? So one of the things is that we face these ongoing industrial challenges of where do we go and what do we do? Not we do we do, I apologize for that. It's what do we do? But you can see there are many ideas that go into this ongoing industrial challenge that we face. And there are a number of them. And you can pick out some words in that word cloud, many of which I'm sure you've heard and seen before: cyber infrastructure, analytics, informatics, all of those kinds of things. And in these blue boxes, while they're certainly not an exhaustive list of the challenges that we face in industry today, they certainly are some of the more compelling ones. And these are very much germane to the Air Force, to AFMC, to LCMC in particular, and the OEMs and small businesses that support the Air Force. You know, driving product lifecycle data with high fidelity representations, the difficulty in hiring new workers with the requisite knowledge that we need, the supply chain and how it's being affected, increasing complexity of products, security, even though we're moving into mobile and collaborative interfaces and enterprises. And so as we think about this gives us a backdrop for the remainder of what it is that we're going to talk about today. So let's talk a little bit about collaboration. And this is a bit of a historical view of how we often collaborated. But again, pre-COVID, we would often collaborate face-to-face. A lot of times things might happen, communications in particular, in a rather serial fashion. We often tended to use artifacts like this example of a technical drawing that's shown in the bottom right corner of the screen. And this is what we use to facilitate our communications. We often trusted this process and we trusted that information because we knew the person or could interact with the person that generated that information. Or somewhat ironically, maybe we didn't trust that information because we knew the person that had generated it. But regardless, there was a great deal of human interaction that occurred and a very discrete exchange of information that happened along the way when we would collaborate with each other. And when we would support work, we would often share these artifacts with each other in order to do that. So I want to show you an example of something. Most of you, as you look at this, can readily identify what this object is. And so you ask yourself, well, how do we know what that is? You know, it's a boat, basically. Some people might even be more specific and say that it's a sailboat. How do we know that? So as we look at an artifact like this, there are a number of things that tell us what that object is. Part of it's our own experience as human beings. Part of it is seeing that information in day-to-day life, or seeing that object, I should say, in day-to-day life. Some of us may have even experienced it more directly. But even if none of that had happened, there is an awful lot of information depicted in this drawing. And one of the challenges that we have in going forward in Industry 4.0 and the digitalization of information that comes with it is that historically artifacts like this drawing were very rich in information, except much of that information and much of that the context that we use in order to describe it was based on our own experiences. And in many cases, the digital realm of communication is not incredibly rich in context. And in many cases, it can be just as confusing at times as it is helpful. And so this idea of capturing tacit and implicit knowledge that goes with our, in this case, platforms that, or weapon systems or aircraft or other vehicles, it's not just the shape description. It's not just the geometric information that goes with that object that's necessary upstream and downstream, right? It's all of the behavioral, contextual, mission parameter type of information that goes with it. And from my experiences in interacting with the Air Force and other defense-oriented organizations, therein lies one of the challenges in moving forward in this digital world is how do we access that information? And maybe even more specifically, which information do we access? And so that particular theme of this movement away from paper-based environments creates a particular challenge in this particular world. I know many of you who are attending today have probably heard this concept of a model-based definition and this idea of using three-dimensional models and the information associated with them inside technical data packages across the life cycle of the platform. You know, that's something that is in the DoD digital engineering strategy. It's laid out, maybe not quite that specifically, but it is certainly referenced and attended to in that document. Dr. Roper a couple weeks ago in a presentation was talking about those sorts of information types. Major General Cooley in his presentation, again, maybe not by these specific words, but was referencing the need for that information. I want to present it just slightly differently today, and that is, you know, in as much as we might ask for information or that acquisition managers or even sustainment managers and others who use this information across the life cycle may in fact ask for this information, it's important to understand what it is we need to ask for. Because as we move away from paper-based, environments where information was more easily captured, and in many respects, it did not experience, I should say, too many barriers to its sharing or its translation. The digital environment is not exactly the same in the sense that not all the information that we may need might be wholly contained or mostly contained inside one artifact. We may have to pull from various environments to get that information that holistically needs to travel across the life cycle with that particular aircraft or vehicle or weapon system or what it might be. And not that we did not have to deal with that issue in the past. However, the pace or velocity with which information travels in the digital world in some cases makes this easier. In other cases, it makes it more difficult. But the last thing I want to leave you with on this particular slide is that as we move into these model-based worlds and we move into these model-based artifacts of information that come to us, it's important to understand the communication paradigm in which the author and the consumer of that information exists. And I say it that way because as human beings, we are very much attuned to communicating with each other. Although we may argue that some of us don't do that particularly well, but the point is that human-to-human communication is a reasonably well understood, reasonably well-bounded communication paradigm. From a human-to-machine perspective, we've been programming machines for a long time. We've been giving machines computer numerical instruction, if you will, for a long time. And it's, again, a reasonably well understood paradigm by which to communicate. On the flip side, we've been having machines, whether they be machine tools, whether they be vehicles, whether they be computing platforms, able to give us information in a human form that we can understand. And again, for the last 50, 60 years, we've been able to do that. Not without certain challenges, but again, the challenges are, again, reasonably well understood, or at least identified in a way that we can mitigate the repercussions of the situation when things may not necessarily go so well. But one of the key challenges left in moving towards this Industry 4.0 environment is the fact that machine-to-machine communication is going to become incredibly important, whether it's for automated environments, whether it is for diagnostic environments, maybe even for predictive environments. But my point is that with machine-to-machine communication, we often need that to work as well, if not better than, the semantically rich human-to-human information. Yet we all know that machines do not readily associate or pick up or interpret human readable language or human readable information as well as we would like for them to. There's certainly ongoing research and development in this space, and I suspect, at least from my own experience, that we'll ultimately get there. But right now we're not there yet, and there's still a journey to be had. Yet that is one of our ultimate targets, is the ability to have machine-to-machine communication be as fluid and as accurate and as understandable, if you will, as human-to-human communication. But one of the things that has to be in place in order for that to happen is a language of information, is a thread of information, if you will, that is complete, that is unbroken, that is unambiguous, because machines don't necessarily deal very well with ambiguity. And so, again, as humans, we can base a lot of our understanding on context. And because of our ability to do that, we can filter out ambiguity most of the time. But for right now, it is difficult for machines to do that. So any of these three paradigms where machines are involved, we have to be extra careful in how we author and how we package information, because it might be that the downstream consumer of that information may not be a human being. It might in fact be a machine. And I don't necessarily mean, even though I showed the icon on the screen there of a machine tool or some sort of robotic kind of scenario. A machine could be something as simple as a computer. And so we need to be prepared for that. And so when we think about this idea of an integrated product lifecycle, and I mentioned this before, we also need to think about an integrated product data lifecycle. And my point here is that in as much as we have come to this point with, for example, having three-dimensional models and simulations of platforms, the ability to manufacture and to inspect based on accurate geometric representations, that is the limit in some cases of where our digital models begin to break down. For example, we don't have very thorough or very consistent materials attributes captured in our models. We often don't have very consistent or very accurate process models captured with the geometric representation. In a lot of cases, we don't have accurate maintenance planning captured with the design definitions. And so my point in saying all of this is that while notionally we like to depict the life cycle as this circular figure that seems to be continuous and it seems to be sort of ever going, it's not actually as continuous and not as ever going as many people believe. There are still gaps, obviously, between some of these different phases of a life cycle. And one of the challenges for the Air Force or for the DoD in general is that while each particular branch or each particular program officer may specify the parameters they need for a platform, and then they might also receive that platform into service and sustain it over its lifetime, there's a big chunk of the life cycle of that product, the design, the testing, the production, and the like, that our colleagues within the defense community are only partially related to. As OEMs go off and build aircraft or vehicles or weapons systems and such, there's a certain part of that the military services are only partially connected to, and because we buy from those OEMs, those prime contractors, the platforms that we want, hopefully according to the specifications that they were given, and hopefully on time and on budget. But because the services from a acquisition and sustainment perspective are often missing certain elements of information that go along with the design and the production of those systems, this circular graphic that's shown on the screen here is in many cases incomplete for the acquisition and sustainment community inside the DoD. And so therein lies one of the challenges of deploying a lot of these concepts of Industry 4.0. And again, if any of you attended the presentation from Dr. Roper a couple weeks ago, or even were attending the presentation this morning, those kinds of things were alluded to in those presentations. And so being more strategic, more selective, more insistent in some cases around acquiring that kind of information along with the finished product, whatever that happens to be, is also incredibly important, because while we like to depict a figure like this for a life cycle view of things, we like to depict that in a circular fashion. That arrow that you see sort of in the upper left quadrant of the graphic at about 11 o'clock there, it's there for a reason. And that is because going from a long-term sustainment and archival part of a life cycle back into the needs assessments, requirement definitions, and early designs of whatever the next iteration of the platform is often very difficult. And that's not a situation that's unique to the defense community. It happens in automotive, it happens in medical device, it happens in consumer products, it happens in many other sectors. And one of the contributing factors to that is that the information that's often contained in the latter stages of a product's life cycle is not in a form that the people working at the beginnings of the next life cycle are often able to use. And so this will come up a little bit later in the presentation when we talk about the need to be, to package information in a way that is not just fit for purpose, but is also dynamic in the sense that we can repurpose information with more ease than we are able to today. And so with that brings me to this notion of the digital thread. And again, I suspect most of you, if not all of you on the call, have heard that term and probably have your own definition in your mind of what that means. But my point here is that this digital thread truly does need to encompass the entire life cycle, if in fact we're going to be able to achieve what is in the Department of Defense digital engineering strategy going forward. And the idea is that all the way from something as basic and fundamental as material selection and geometry development and testing and so on, all the way through the component design to the vehicle platform level design, and ultimately to the fleet level of whatever that product happens to be, we have to be able to make decisions on the integrations that exist at multiple levels. We have to be able to take a systems approach, and in many cases, the models of those systems become increasingly important. And models of systems can't just be block diagrams. I mean, that's one way that they can be used, but that can't be the only thing that we rely on. We've got to be able to rely on an integrated geometric materials and behavior and contextual definition of that model that is accessible to the layperson, not just the expert who might be in design or in production or in sustainment, but also to people in other phases of that life cycle. Because without that level of integration, the challenge is these models simply become just another digital artifact that someone has to navigate or negotiate with in order to accomplish their particular task. And so when we think about how that gets done, we have to really look at the form that the information takes and how we can put that through a stack of commercial or government-owned software and hardware technologies that allow us to communicate that widely. And so when we think about that, one of the key elements that we have in this discussion is the concept of a digital twin. And again, I know all of you have likely heard a discussion about the digital twin. Again, I'm sure many of you probably have your own definition of a digital twin and what that means. But in order to get to that point, there are certain types of information, certain bits of information that have to exist. And one of the things that is widely discussed, within this particular community these days is, what form should that idea of a digital twin take? What kinds of attributes should it have? What sorts of elements of information should be in it? And the issue, at least in my opinion, one of the issues is that as we move through this transformation of information, going from a drawing-based paradigm to a CAD-based paradigm to a model-based paradigm, ultimately to this idea of a virtual and life cycle-based paradigm, the movement that we have through that progression, through that evolution. This is not just a technology evolution, it's an information evolution as well. And I'm sure many of you on the call this morning have probably experienced information in some of the forms that are shown here on this slide. Others of you may not, but as we think about that richness of information that I spoke about when I was referring to the technical drawing a few slides back, is that we have to be able to make decisions based on this information that are in many cases far more dynamic or even far more complex than what we were able to process in a paper-based world. Secondly, is that if you look here on the bullet points to the left, we need to be able to predict what our environments may be like, because building prototypes is expensive. It reminds me of a video that came out and is, I'm sure, on YouTube if you look hard enough for it and can find it. It was a video of engineers testing the new 787 aircraft when it was first going into production. And if any of you have seen it, there's a video where basically they are breaking the joint where the wings meet the fuselage of the airplane, and showing the gauge as they put more and more stress on the wing, and ultimately the joint fails and the gauge gives them a reading, and you'll hear cheering and other things in the video, and everyone seems to be pretty happy. And I suppose it's not every day you get to rip the wings off an airplane, but the point being is that one of the reasons why a number of people were happy and cheering about that is because the value that came up in the test and the physical test matched the value that had been done in their virtual test. And that, I think for some people, they may look at that and go, well, so what? Well, one of the challenges we have in this environment, though, is as human beings, we tend to prefer examples or interactions or results that we can see, that we can put our hands on, that we can observe directly. A lot of that is human nature, but a lot of it is also how many of us were trained and educated. And one of the things that this digital environment gives us is the ability to, figuratively speaking, rip the wings off the plane over and over and over again without having to build expensive physical prototypes, without having to do things that might arguably be dangerous to the human operators that are nearby. However, it's not necessarily free. It does come at a cost. Obviously, there are computing costs and cycle times for running simulations like that, especially ones that have a lot of parameters and variables. Even though we have a lot of high performance computing, there's some of those do take a little while still. But more importantly, the initial data set comes at a cost. One of the things that people talk about a lot is that they've said to me in the past, okay, Nate, that's all fine and good. We're going to switch to this model-based world, and it might make everybody happy, but there's a cost to creating all of that, and they're absolutely right. There's a cost in time and effort that goes along with building a high fidelity model in the first place. And so while some people consider the idea of a digital environment may ultimately save them some costs, that may very well be true. And in many cases across the industry sectors, we've seen instances where moving to a digital environment have indeed saved people money and time. But in many cases, they may not necessarily see a net savings. They may just see savings in different places, because there is a cost, to be fair, to building these kinds of digital models and building them at a high enough fidelity with enough detail and enough confidence to be able to make these sorts of predictions. Yet one of the places where the various industry sectors have seen cost savings in some instances has been within the supply chain. And this is particularly important because when you think about the supply chain, especially in a defense-oriented context, supply chains can be really long, and they can be really complex, and they can be filled with large enterprise OEMs. They can include small 5 or 10 person companies and everything in between. One of the challenges that the supply networks that many of us use in a production environment, one of the challenges they face is being able to find information. It has continued to surprise me that in some instances, the only insight someone has as to where their raw materials may be or where their finished product is the tracking number that they get from their favorite courier service when they make a shipment. And for any of you who may have ever ordered anything online and you were, patiently or maybe not so patiently clicking that tracking number to figure out when is my stuff going to arrive, there are companies in the defense supply chain, as well as other supply chains, where that's the only insight they have also. And so one of the challenges, and again, the recent COVID-19 pandemic brought some of this to light as well, is that we need much more visibility into where our materials are, where our subassemblies are, where our finished products are in that supply chain. And, in some respects, I mean, I guess I've never served in the military, so I've never quite understood with any personal, I guess, experience the surge that happens when we send troops into conflict, or when we deploy them anywhere around the world. But having talked to a number of people in defense-related organizations, that surge is a very real thing. And in many cases, one of the things that is often tested when that happens is our supply chain network, and whether or not there is a readiness level of those troops to go into that environment, or those platforms, those weapon systems, those vehicles, those aircrafts, to be able to go into a situation and be ready. And that part of that issue is one that deals with supply chain. And so at a basic level, one of the things that's germane to this conversation about Industry 4.0 and about supply chains is not so much each one of these boxes that you see on this slide. It's really more about, at least in my opinion, it's more about the green arrows. Can we effectively move accurate information, unambiguous information to support the supply chain in producing what it is that we need in a timely manner and at a cost that we can absorb? And so when we think about enabling that digital twin, what we're really thinking about, and this particular slide has a lot going on in it, but it's my prediction that what we currently think about today as a model-based definition, for many people that means a three-dimensional computer-aided design model that has all of the PMI, product manufacturing information, on it or embedded in it, and it's clear and complete and unambiguous when it comes to the geometry and the topology of the object. It may or may not have material information. It may or may not have process information. It more than likely does not have at all any contextual information in it. But there's two things about this slide that I would encourage you to take away from this, and that is the idea of this eventual merger between what we call model-based definition today and what many of us speculate will be the digital twin of tomorrow. At some point, it's my contention that these two things need to come together in order for Industry 4.0 to reach sort of its promise or its potential. And secondly, the digital thread only works if we have the proper information, but also the IT architecture and the connectivity models to support that. And that's critically important because, as General Cooley mentioned in his presentation, one of the goals for AFMC is to be able to have a technology stack that others outside the organization can be able to access in order to provide better, more accurate, less ambiguous kinds of information. And so how do we actually enable this digital twin? Part of it is having enough accurate information to be able to build these predictive models. And ultimately, one of the comparisons we have to be able to make, and some of this happens over time, but also some of it happens in a much more immediate sense, is we have to be able to compare the as designed digital definition to the as manufactured definition to the as used definition. And while we're getting better at being able to compare as designed and as manufactured from sort of a first article inspection and a quality metrics point of view, getting as used information is still difficult. And the return trip from as used back to as manufactured and back to as designed is still out of reach for many people. It's getting better for sure, and there's advances all the time in terms of digital representation of information, in terms of network connectivity, in terms of just awareness and understanding. But we're still not there yet on on the latter stages of the outbound trip, and certainly not on most of the return trip of that information. But until we can get to that point, we're still likely to struggle in an environment where we need to, excuse me, to be able to make predictions off of a digital representation of the platform and of the object. And while I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this particular slide, I think it's important to show and for people to understand that one of the things that will enable us to get there, it won't be the only thing that enables us, and it certainly won't fix all of our challenges and problems, but is the idea of standards across the life cycle. And I suspect that many of you on the line today watching have seen various items that are on this slide. It's not so much the importance of the standards themselves that are listed here. What's important is to know that there are in fact standards that cover the life cycle in many cases. However, what you'll notice is that the only ones yet that seem to cover or be applicable to the entire life cycle are those standards that tend to deal with the geometry or the visual, or by extension, the human consumable part of that digital definition. What's still lacking are some of those machine-to-machine communication type standards that allow that digital thread to happen on another level besides human-to-human communication. And so one of the last things that I want to share in this section is really about cleaning up some vocabulary. And I suspect that these slides may be available to everyone after the presentation, so I don't expect anyone to read this entire slide. However, I put it up here for a reason, which is really to say that one of the challenges we have in this paradigm that we're getting into is people tend to use either the same word or very similar words, and they will intend the meaning to be rather different. And one of the things that hangs us up in many cases, particularly in the standards community, is this discussion around vocabulary and what does a particular term mean. And so one of the things that I've offered up recently to the standards community has been one possible way to think of this is to break it down into categories. And so I think many of you have probably heard the phrase model-based enterprise, but how many of you, I'll say it this way, even though I can't see anyone's hands go up, is how many of you might have thought that MBE meant model-based engineering and not model-based enterprise? Now, I am not the sole authority on these terms, but I'm saying it to simply illustrate a point, is that if MBE, capital letter E, means model-based enterprise, does that mean that MB and lowercase e means model-based engineering? I guess I'm advocating that it should. Not necessarily that it does, but it should. There should be differences between those acronyms because, and frankly, the understanding of those acronyms, because one of them describes an environment and the other one describes an activity or actions that happen in that environment. And they only happen in that environment because things are done a certain way. And that model-based definition is actually an artifact. It's a thing that we need to get to and create. And so with that, we need to be able to leverage product and process definition across the life cycle. And there needs to be a reciprocal round trip of information. Right now, we're getting better at the outbound trip, but we're not doing as well at the return trip. And that's where we have room for growth for sure. So with that, oops. Oh, there we go. I apologize. Let me back up one session. So why is all of this important? Well, first of all, our economy is becoming increasingly dependent upon digital. The items on the right come from an Accenture study that was done about 24 months ago. And I suspect that some of these numbers may even in fact be more important and more salient today. But what I really want to leave you with is two things on this slide. One is the importance of the items on the right and the value of data. And so when the AFMC, LCMC, or any others for that matter within the DoD environment enter into contractual arrangements, it's important to understand the value that that data has and being able to compute it accurately. Because ultimately, the areas on that graphic to the left where those gray circles come together and the boundary between the blue circle and the gray circle are those interfaces that we talk about. And in many cases, we lose time, we lose effort, we lose accuracy as we try to navigate those interfaces between different functional areas of an enterprise. Moreover, we have this national dilemma sitting in front of us. It's been characterized as the silver tsunami. It's been characterized as reskilling. It's been characterized as upskilling. But the point is this: the future of digital work requires a workforce that is ready to work in it. And as I was talking to Chris before the presentation this morning, I said I'm gonna try not to show too much of my education bias here. But the point is that we can't just simply get rid of the existing workforce and hire a brand new one. It doesn't work that way. And so we need a combination of filling both the pipeline of new workers, but also addressing the pyramid of incumbent workers. And when we do that, we have to remember a couple things. One is the average person born today can have a life expectancy of 100 years old, which means their working life might be 60 or 70 years, as opposed to, on average, what might have been 30 or 40 years for some of us, or maybe our parents or grandparents, and so on. And so we need to begin to think about work differently. We need to begin to think about the value that people bring to this. And frankly, we have to, in some ways, get over about 300 years of inertia of our traditional education environment to be able to move past where we are today, because ultimately the digitalization of things is changing that equilibrium. And I'm sure some of you have seen this particular graphic before, but the reason I used it is because there are impacts to this next generation workforce that can't be discounted. That we need data literacy, we need technological literacy, but we also need human literacy. For those of you that may have children in school today, you may have noticed, if you've been helping them do their homework, that the way they're being taught today is a lot different than many of us were being taught in the past. And whether you agree with that or not, it is the way they're being taught. And in many cases, many states have changed their elementary school, middle school, high school educational standards to address this transformation into a more digital, a more data-centric world. And so with that, one of the things to keep in mind is that as much as there is an industrial revolution, there has always been a parallel educational revolution that is taking place. Apprenticeship to industrial arts, what many of us would have known like in high school or middle school as industrial arts, to technology education, and now to this idea of a maker movement and systems thinking. And again, this might be a little bit easier reference for those of you that have children in school, but it is very much a change in the way that they're being taught. But what we're moving towards is a more personalized set of credentials, a stackable set of credentials. And here's a model that exists for this kind of an environment. And really what's important here is that the percentages on the left. And my point is that we need to start off with a level of literacy in this digital transformation that everyone experiences, so that we can at least speak a common language and have common levels of understanding. And then from there, the organization can make its decisions on how many people need to reach a competency level and how many people need to reach a mastery level in order to begin to prepare for this transformation into a digital enterprise, and ultimately to be able to keep that transformation going. And so with that, I will end my presentation and pass the control back over to Chris. Thank you all very much. Chris, I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. The mute button makes a difference. So, Nate, what are the top 5 things employers are asking the university to support in order to help them adopt digital practices in Industry 4.0?
One of them is the idea of readiness and being able to assess someone's readiness or an organization's readiness to be able to transform in this space. Second thing is a general level of literacy from graduates, and not just engineering or technical graduates, but also graduates from, say, the business school of a university or in a computer science department, people who may not often be readily related in their curriculum to a manufacturing or an engineering environment. The third thing that we hear a lot here at Purdue is continuing to have a willingness to engage with, I'll say, industry, but I think that could also mean government as well, in the sense that working on or maybe shifting the balance towards doing, relatively speaking, research that is potentially a little more applied, as opposed to research historically from a university that's been a little more fundamental. Obviously, that's a bit of a balancing act, but it's certainly one that needs to be balanced nonetheless. A fourth thing I think that I've been hearing off and on is this, and it's becoming louder lately, is the idea of stackable credentials that I talked about in the last slide, is that not everyone has time for or even maybe a need for a degree in the traditional sense. And so those schools that I think can package up, it's got to be relevant content, but certainly package that up in a way that is deliverable and digestible to people in sort of fit for purpose or fit for use kinds of chunks, as opposed to having someone go through an entire degree program, is most useful. Chris, those are really kind of the top 4. I don't know if I can really think of a fifth one, but those are the ones we hear a lot.
Oh, that's all right. So of the other questions, there's one, you had several references to long-term access and retrieval. And obviously organizations like the DoD hold on to their assets for a very long time. What kind of progress is being made on enabling that within the software industry so that we can actually have low tar for a 50-year-old model that we may have not touched for a while?
Well, that's a loaded question for sure, but I would say that so to maybe to all my friends out there from the software community, I think really, Chris, there is in fact progress being made. I mean, I certainly do not want to give the impression that progress is not being made. I think one might be able to argue how rapid the process is being made. But I think this brings into some pretty sharp relief a challenge that we have in terms of the way the business models in the software community have developed over time compared to the needs of the user community and how that's developed over time. As I've worked in and out of the standards community over probably the last 10, maybe 15 years, one of the things that has, to be fair, surprised me a little bit is that the standards themselves, as they are written, are often written rather holistically and rather well. I mean, on average. What's often a challenge is the way in which those data exchange standards are implemented by way of the software systems that are used to either author or consume that information. I think another thing that I've observed recently in the standards community has been sort of the influence of particular industry sectors who have a lot to advocate for and have a lot potentially to lose if their data is not as interoperable as it could be or as usable in the long term as it could be. But one of the things I've tried to encourage has been a more holistic and maybe a wider voice of the customer, if you will, across the standards community. But to be fair, it's also a situation where aerospace and defense, generally speaking, because their life cycles are very long, they may actually be the ones who have the most to gain, or conversely the most to lose, if we don't have a situation where data is accessible and that data is, I guess, forward compatible. And so, it's important not just to archive your data, but to also curate your data at the same time.
Great. Thank you, Nate. Thank you for your time this afternoon. We understand that it takes a lot of effort to volunteer for these activities, and the audience, I'm sure, appreciates all the information you had to share. At this point, we're going to have a short break, and we will move on to our next keynote. Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a good day.